definitively determine that this work is beautiful or not beautiful, unless you over-define what your criteria are. Like if you talk about meaning, there's a lot more space in it. And I when I had that conversation with philosophers, it led me back to that sense of what I think I experienced as a scientist who was going to church and volunteering in a soup kitchen. I found meaning in my life that I hadn't found in my scientific work. I think some people do find meaning in their scientific work, and I think that's what the lecturer was speaking to, that he found a meaning and a joy that drove him every day to get up and go out. But not everyone finds that meaning in the same place. And that's where I think the hubris of the success of sort of the Enlightenment scientific enterprise has taken us into an alley that I'm not sure it's been. We need to figure out how to get back out of.
So at this time, I would just like to bring our attention to the fact that it's about 5:15. Could I see a raise of hands of people who still have questions? I know there's 1, 2, 3. 3 questions. If you need to leave for any reason, please feel free to do so, but stay as long as our speakers are willing to field questions.
It's me. Hi, Joel. So I'm a medieval historian. I'm also French, so I have Pascal behind me. I'm going to try to be coherent. So I'm coming from a background which is different from yours. And as an historian, I teach a lot about the history of religion because I am a medieval historian. And of course, one of the first things I do in my classes is I make students read the first story of Genesis, creation of men and women, then the second story, creation of men and women. And have you noticed, most of the people remember one story, but the one where Eve comes from here, but do not remember the one where Eve and Adam were created equal. So that's a story like another. And then I go, well, you know, in 386, there was a council, the Council of Rome, which sat down a bunch of bishops and decided that book in, that book out, that book in, that book out. And what made me somewhat nervous was most of the first questions were questions based on what is called sacred scripture. And then you went on with fake news, and I'm wondering to a certain extent, where do we go? I mean, there is not big difference, if I look at it outside of religion, between a bunch of old guys deciding, I'm going to keep this book, I'm not going to keep this book, and somebody writing, you know, op-eds saying that climate change does not exist. So I'm pushing it here. But then, so that's one issue. But then the other issue is, how can you put that together and think that you can rationally think about religion when in fact you go back to a book, to a sacred scripture, which was somewhat man creation. So that's what I want to try to understand coming from you, from the both of you.
Okay, who wants to go first? Flip a coin?
I toss it over to President Dooley. I'll take this one first, and you can think of a better answer, clean up my mess. A couple things. So I speak as an Anglican, and within Anglicanism, similar to within Roman Catholicism, the biblical witness is part of what goes into creating a religious worldview. It is not the single expression of what goes into creating a religious worldview. I think, and again, I go back to a lot of the American perception of the conflict between science and religion is generated out of the lost cause narrative and a fight between how we would use the Bible to explain what we were doing. So, and that whole conversation from the beginning privileges the biblical witness of all the other ones. In my personal tradition of Anglicanism, it's scripture tradition, and reason that are in conversation with one another. And Scripture, when it's shown to be illogical, needs to have a deeper meaning as opposed to a literal meaning. So right from there, we're handling our source material. It doesn't particularly surprise anybody if there be contradictions within the source material. It's not supposed to be read that way. The question about the setting of the canon that you're talking about in the Council 386 is absolutely correct. It's a funny. So it's not just that people were sitting around one day and said, "We're going to make only these books be in the Bible." Because there wasn't that controversy. It was someone said, these books aren't in the Bible, but these ones are. And it was a guy named Marcion who started claiming that only the things that Paul wrote and only the things that, only Luke's gospel was the real good stuff, and the rest you just toss. And the rest of the church said, no, that's not right. You have to read the whole thing in a conversation. So it's not just simply a matter of people trying to hide books. There are hidden books, but we have them. And people find them useful to read. Gospel of Thomas, The Shepherd of Hermas are all books that I have on my shelf, and I've read and I've studied and even taught from. And they bring unique perspectives to it. I really, this idea of a set of irrational beliefs that, and they are irrational beliefs. And I have to admit that there is, I cannot prove the beliefs scientifically. I think that's interesting. But I also remember, if you do a symbolic analysis of what Anselm was doing in what was misunderstood, I think, by Aquinas in the ontological proof of God, you can do the symbolic analysis of Anselm's argument, and what Anselm is kind of showing consistently is you can't disprove the existence of God. Well, that's kind of interesting. I would love to be able to prove that you can't prove the existence of God, but I'm not smart enough to figure out if that's even possible. But I think that's what Anselm's doing. And it's what the psalmist says. He's playing off, was it Psalm 54? The fool says in his heart, there is no God. I think that's Psalm 54.
You ask a very good question, Joel, as you always do every time we have a conversation, it seems. And I struggle with exactly the same thing in my own experience. I mean, there's this you can argue that there's an arbitrariness to what's included in the 66 books of the canonical Bible that are now
Of the Southern Baptist Bible.
the Southern Baptist Bible.
Which is not the same as the Roman Catholic Bible or the Anglican Bible.
Okay, true.
No, right there you have.
There you have the element. It's obviously been shaped by human, I think, impulses and human conclusions about what's valid or more valid than something else that they have as a text. And you can view that, as I did, as a reason to just not believe the whole thing. Because, well, you can't resolve that sort of arbitrary nature of assembling what you call the sacred texts. And in some elements of American Christianity, there's no possibility of questioning that. I mean, the Bible is quite truly believed to be literally inspired, every word, by God himself.
Inerrant, infallible in the original autograph.
Right.
Is one of the fundamentals of the fundamentalists.
I remember as a teenager, and I was a graduate student, coming across a painting of this. I think it was in, not in the Uffizi, but the other famous gallery in Florence. That literally was a painting of Paul writing, and to his left was an angel whispering in his ear. And that is the view that particularly elements of fundamentalist Christianity hold as the origins of the Bible. And if that's your view of the origins of the Bible, then you're highly constrained in how you can think about what you read.
In a technical sense.
Yeah.
Highly constrained system.
Yeah.
Few degrees of freedom.
Few degrees of freedom, exactly. And I always thought, and still believe to this day, that's absurd. But that's the kind of thing you can easily get into arguments that there's no ending to with many people. So I don't think they're worth having. It's not my personal view. It's never been my view, and it was one of the many things that my father and I had a permanent falling out over that we frankly never overcome. But I think faith, religious faith, Christian faith is actually not dependent upon that view because it is more experiential and it does depend a lot on the meaning that one finds in the Christian experience, in the faith experience, and in what that means in their lives. And there's no question that enormously good things and enormously bad things have happened out of that experience. That's the problem I have with arguments about meaning, is finding meaning in your life led to the Inquisition. People were some of those people were probably very well intentioned and believed they were actually doing God's work that was bringing great meaning to their lives as they were doing it, but no one today would argue that that could possibly be consistent with anything of the character of God that the Christians profess to believe in. So we are always confronted by those kinds of human contradictions in religious narratives that we see, and particularly in the Christian narrative. It's been said by everybody who's ever looked at Christianity seriously, I think, that the greatest argument against Christianity being true is the behavior of Christians. And frankly, that's an argument that still haunts me, because there's an awful lot of accurate feeling wrapped up in that observation, and we each have to deal with that in our own way, I think. But we most successfully deal with that when we bring our own way into a Christian community or faith community of any kind and work through it collectively.
The last time the church had a serious conversation about what was in the Bible and what was not in the Bible was in the Reformation. And Martin Luther wanted to get rid of the book of James. He did. He in his very Martin Luther way, he called it a blankety blank, blank, blank book. And the other reformers wouldn't let him take it out because it was seen as a corrective on one view. And I think that's the key thing within the biblical witness as we have it, and as we stubbornly insist on it. And I am not a fundamentalist. I have family members who are fundamentalists, and they really need to speak to themselves. And it's not fair for me to characterize their faith, and I don't mean to demean the faith. It's just not the faith that I have. But within my tradition, the conversation between what Paul says and what John says and what James says, which are usually contradictory within the Bible, is there by design, because it is the conversation that circles around an idea to try to find the truth of it. I'm reminded of scattering. If I want to know the shape of a nucleus, I throw a lot of small subatomic particles at it, or ions or whatever, and I see how they scatter out. And it's by scattering from different directions that I can ultimately get the full shape of the thing that I can't see directly. It just seems to me an evocative metaphor there for the insistence, not that some books shouldn't be in the Bible and some should, but that all these contradictory books are included within the conversation. That's a different way to put that question that you're asking.
Thank you. Next question.
You're probably familiar with the name of Ronald Dworkin,
Oh, yeah.
who is widely considered the preeminent philosopher of law of his generation. And early in this century, he gave the Einstein lectures, and out of those, he wrote a wonderful brief book called Religion Without God. And the basic point he's trying to make there is what gives overarching meaning to any of us, regardless of religion absence of religion is some kind of unifying, meaning-giving framework of ethics and value and morality. And he also makes the proposition that any of us who have that as part of our worldview, that is foundational to faith and a belief in God and so forth, insofar as God validates, or our faith validates, that overarching, unifying way of giving meaning to our life. But the punchline that Dworkin is proposing is you don't have to be a person of faith to have that unifying, undergirding, moral, ethical set of values. I'm just wondering what your take would be on Dworkin's position. And he has died as of 8 years ago, so he won't be offended.
I see nothing to disagree with. What I was alluding to earlier, and there is within Christian thought and within Buddhist thought, and I think within Jewish thought, this conversation is a philosophical system that we live by of ethical responsibilities to other people, or is this a belief in a deity that we have a relationship with? And for some people, the answer is yes to the first, and some people, and no to the second. For some people, it's yes to both, and for some people, I think you could argue that ultimately it's the relationship and not the details that are important. That's I think he's absolutely right. If he said that's the only way to do it, then I'd probably say I could probably find a couple counterexamples.
I think one of the more interesting conversations that I like to read about it, at least, is the one, and it's not really as dichotomous as I'm going to portray it, but basically the conversation is this: either our ethical views, our ethical principles, the basic ideas of morality were somehow conveyed to us, and this is often the religious argument, they were conveyed to us by the Creator God, and are in the Ten Commandments and a host of other sacred texts, if you will. They have that origin. Alternatively, if that's completely false, there is no God, and therefore there can be no source of ethics from a creator, then everything we call ethics, morality is of human origin, and it's primarily of human origin driven by Darwinian evolution and natural selection. And so therefore the question becomes, where do these ideals come from in nature for altruistic behavior? Can we find evidence in nature for, being kind to your neighbor, so to speak? Is this something that could have evolved as life evolved on the planet? These moral and ethical values which so many humans hold in common. And if that's not the case, then how did they arise? And that's an interesting question. And a related question, an aesthetic one that you're beginning to see scientists, evolutionary scientists debate now, is that they're beginning to call into questions the very fundamental notion of why we find things beautiful. Why are some things beautiful and why are some things ugly? If there's not an aesthetic behind that comes from something other than the physical world, why do we hold that view, and how did that ever evolve? And the traditional evolutionary viewpoints that have been given on that, which basically boil down to it's an advantage in attracting a mate, may not hold water. Scientists are now, evolutionary biologists are there. That may not be an adequate explanation for the appreciation and appearance of what we see beauty in nature, particularly in organisms. So it's a very open question in a lot of respects, and an incompletely answered one at this point, that I find really fascinating. And obviously people of faith can give one explanation, and
give a lot of
different explanations, and strict naturalists can give, or are struggling to give, very different ones. And it's an interesting moment right now to see it actually playing out in the scientific literature, this question of can we explain these kinds of things strictly on the basis of natural selection and genetic mutation.
I mean, it's related to the question, do humans have free will? From a scientific, or are our genetics and our environment completely deterministic, and we only have the illusion of free will? The illusion of this is beautiful or that's not beautiful. And that's a really hard question. I don't think anyone, at least in the scientific world, is getting close. To me, it's right up there with the question of where does consciousness come from? Is consciousness emergent, or is consciousness an inherent quality of nature? If I had time, and I wasn't doing what I do for a living, I would love to spend some time thinking hard about that question, because I think that's a fundamentally important question.
I agree.
I think we had one question over on this side. Okay. Should be the last one. Hang on.
We'll be quicker, because there's another person up here who's been very patiently waiting too. So, and they'll answer quicker. Now you take as long as you need.
There's someone out here in the
Right
front.
here in the front. Who's had his hand up?
This hand was up.
Yeah,
Is that all right, just proceed?
please.
I'm not certain exactly how to frame my question, primarily because I'm recalling a conversation and discussions between Carl Sagan and the Dalai Lama on science and religion. And as I remember it, Sagan asked him toward the end of that discussion about how would he respond if some kind of scientific finding were to emerge in the future that might dismay him and woo him away from Buddhism. And I think that the Dalai Lama responded that Buddhism is not a religion, it's not scripture, but it's the science of the mind. And I wondered, would you have some parallel response as a Christian? How would we respond as Christians to that same question?
Well, historically what we've done is close our eyes and hum.
Well, I'm not sure. and I think that's the conundrum that frankly a lot of us are in. The existence of alien life forms is one of the really fascinating puzzles for science. If you think about it for a minute, given the scale of the universe, one of two things must be true. One of three things. Either our understanding of the process that led to the evolution of life on Earth happened far less frequently than we would think they would, given the chemistry and physics involved, and so we're alone in this incredibly vast universe. Or, secondly, the universe is teeming with creatures, intelligent life, that for some reason or another choose not to communicate. Or three, most life begins many places in the universe, but it's improbable for it to last, and most of it is extinguished very early on, and it's intelligent life of the kind that we know. That's so incredibly rare. And the fourth, which many people think the scariest hypothesis of all, is you don't communicate because if you do, people will come and wipe you out. And everybody else in the universe knows it, and they're shutting up, and we're broadcasting everything out into space. And someday people are going to show up, and that'll be the end of us.
Every time in human history, pretty much every time a more advanced technological society has encountered a less advanced technological society, they've enslaved and stolen. I mean, it's just,
No, it's true. There's a great science fiction story of aliens coming to Earth and announcing to the assembled masses at a special, the UN, we're very, very sorry, but we've sold this part of the universe to this different empire. And whereas we've been very generous and have stayed and have allowed you to develop unhindered, we're very sorry to say that your new owners The new masters of this part of the universe have a very different attitude. And it was really playing out in a science fiction story exactly what happened to Native Americans and Pacific Islanders all over this world as various people arrived and said, well, I'm very, very sorry, but Solomon Islands are now part of England, or part of France, or part of the Japanese Empire. to people who had never heard of any of this, and of course were stunned by the technology that appeared in front of them. And to a degree, that's a possible fate.
Yeah, no, I was looking at the British phrase book of the British soldiers were given in South Africa, in Siswati, and like, do not be afraid, we are British soldiers. We will give you a receipt for everything we are taking. These are the phrases that they needed to know.
So this is going to be the last question.
It's actually a multi-part question, but it's very short. Do you gentlemen feel that there, at least in the United States, there's an increasing skepticism, doubt, disbelief about really widely accepted scientific principles? If the answer is yes, you have an explanation for why that is happening, and the corollary to that is, does religion have anything to do with it? And finally, what can be done about it?
Well, I'll answer first, because first of all, what we're seeing right now with regard to the attacks on the science of climate change, we've seen exactly this before. Remember, it was decades after science knew with extremely high certainty, levels of certainty, that smoking cigarettes would kill you by creating cancer, before we were ever able to take any steps whatsoever to limit smoking in America for one reason only, and that was the tobacco industry made sure that no laws that would restrict the sale of tobacco could ever be enacted. There was no question about the science of it all. Fundamentally, science was clear, but it was decades before the science actually was able to be translated into public policy to take active steps to deter cigarette smoking, to actually label cigarette packages that these cause cancer, to remove tobacco advertising from television and other media, and make the decision in the best interest of the people who were being preyed upon. And I think we're in a very similar situation. It's right now with regard to climate change. It's very, I think, evident from any sort of objective analysis of what is happening that there are sectors of global industries that simply cannot countenance serious efforts to cut down the usage of fossil fuels. In the same reason the tobacco industry didn't want people to stop smoking cigarettes. And all that's it, but the story there is simply that these decisions get caught up in a whole host of human factors. Scientific findings don't necessarily determine the course of action that society will take, even when the scientific findings are very clear about what the consequences will be if you don't. We knew that millions of people would and could and did die of cancer who otherwise might not have. That's just a fact. Because of the time it took to actually legislate the changes around smoking. And I think we're on the cusp of seeing the same kind of thing happen now with regard to facing the reality of climate change. That's the human reality in which we live. People have complicated motivations, and we don't all agree as to what goals should be, and we have difficult political processes, difficult in terms of complex, so it's not always easy to forge consensus, to legislate consensus, and to drive change in a timely way because of the complexity and the variety of views that are held in these and different stakeholders that are involved, the influence that they have. So from my perspective as a scientist, we've been through a lot of these cycles before, and I hope we continue to go through them. And it's always so far been the case that we've been able to work through them eventually and chart a course that will mitigate the damages that we come to understand are inherent in behaviors that we undertake. And we hope to see the same in the future.
I think so at the base level of evolution and relativistic thought was called degenerate science by the Nazis because it was found by Jewish people. So it was automatically dismissed out of hand. We've learned to live in a kind of cognitive dissonance that allows us to deny the reality we see if it doesn't fit within a larger structure. Now, science ultimately, and because it has the lab bench and because of utility, will win because it will withstand challenges. And the scientific method is designed to use the challenges to sort of get to truth. But I think what's happened in the society, is particularly in the West, as this cognitive dissonance has sort of taken root, is we have shied away from a sense that any citizen who is voting has to have a kind of scientific literacy. And I think that it's not just implication of climate change. Look at the anti-vax movement. I mean, you know, oh my God, we got a measles outbreak, and people are still refusing to vaccine children, right? Because they're not scientific. They'll find a scientific sounding paper, or even maybe a scientific study, but they don't know how to read that scientific study within the realm of other papers and understand how the scientific process works. And it's that scientific illiteracy that is creating, which I think is rooted in a kind of dismissal of scientific enterprise in parts of American society that is leading us to a place where we no longer have the tools we need to make public policy in the way it has to be made. Religion owns that, but not just religion. Racism is at the core of a lot of that. There's a lot of isms that have taken us to this place. And as a former scientific educator, somewhat of the scientific populist, I think that's as important as what I do in a pulpit is what I do with young people, just trying to let them put aside, especially within the religious community, put aside their suspicion of science and embrace it as an incredibly powerful human tool that helps us understand more about the world we live in and to think this is a gift. Because otherwise, I think we're really heading into it. Thomas Friedman says, technology gives us powers with which we are not ready to be given. And individual humans, by technology, are given superpowers. Even at the very level of an atlatl as a spear thrower, makes you throw your spear further. We now have the power to take down a building with a plane. We now have the power by editing a gene sequence to make a disease that we cannot stop. We are not ready as a species to have this power. And if we're going to have it, we better make sure we're scientifically literate enough to know the dangers of it. And I think that's where the academy has an incredible role to play.
Well, this has been quite the journey, hasn't it? I would like to thank all of you for being here, and I know that we could probably continue for much longer time, and now you know why I think these two gentlemen are absolutely incredible. And so Bishop Knisely and President Dooley, thank you so much for these almost 2 hours of your time to share your insights with us, your knowledge, and your expertise. It has been a pleasure to be able to listen to both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.